America did count its gold. This photograph shows federal auditors examining a bar at Fort Knox. But the date is not 1953, it is 1974, and the count did not end that year. According to the Treasury Inspector General, it ended in 2008. 34 years. No single team counted every bar. No single audit opened every compartment. 4 institutions worked in sequence, each accepting parts of the chain built by the people before them, until the United States could say that 100% of its deep storage gold had been inventoried and audited. That sentence is official. It is also carrying an asterisk large enough to cover 3 government facilities. Because 100% does not mean that all the gold was counted at once. It means that by 2008, every sealed compartment at Fort Knox, Denver, and West Point had appeared in one of a long series of partial inventories. Then the doors stayed closed. The modern audit became primarily an inspection of the seals. So the viral claim, "No one has counted the gold since 1953, is false. But the official answer, 100% audited, describes something stranger than most people imagine. And when officials returned to Fort Knox in 2025, what reached the public was an assurance, not a new simultaneous count. This is the story of how America turned 34 years of partial counts into one complete count. And at the center of it is not a gold bar. It is a numbered piece of paper attached to a door. The story people tell about Fort Knox usually begins with a clean date. 1953, the last complete audit. Every bar untouched since Eisenhower. No one allowed to look. It is a perfect premise for a thumbnail. It is also unsupported by the official audit history and contradicted by the 1953 report itself. The Treasury Inspector General's detailed public history of the deep storage audits begins in 1974. The Government Accountability Office's later history begins there too. Neither identifies 1953 as the last complete inventory. So what happened in 1953? The answer is preserved in the Treasury Secretary's annual report for that fiscal year. Fort Knox held 22 sealed compartments. The committee opened 3. Inside those 3 compartments were roughly 88,000 bars, containing 34.4 million fine troy ounces of gold. That is an enormous quantity. It was also only about 9.65% of the gold held at Fort Knox. The committee counted the bars in the 3 opened rooms. It weighed a little over 10% of the gold inside those rooms, around 9,000 bars, and selected 26 bars for tests of fineness. The count agreed with the records in the compartments it saw. Then the report made the leap on which the legend would later stand. It said it was the committee's opinion that the same agreement would be found if all the compartments were verified. If the other 19 compartments were not verified in that operation. So 1953 was not a complete count. It was a partial examination, followed by an opinion about the unopened majority. This does not make the committee dishonest. Sampling and control testing are ordinary audit tools. An auditor is not required to touch every dollar bill in a bank. But words matter when the public question is physical. Were all the gold bars at Fort Knox counted in 1953? No. 3 compartments were opened. Roughly 1/10 of the holdings were counted. The rest were accepted by inference. That changes the mystery. There was no pristine last complete audit to compare with the present. There were partial counts from the beginning. By 1974, the United States had ended the domestic convertibility of dollars into gold decades earlier. President Nixon had closed the international gold window in 1971. Gold still sat behind federal doors, but it no longer functioned as a promise that an ordinary dollar holder could redeem. That distance made room for rumor. Had the bars been sold? Had the government secretly moved them? Was the famous depository empty? In September 1974, members of Congress and journalists went to Fort Knox. The visit has sometimes been described as an audit. It was not. It was a public inspection designed to answer a public fear. Representative John Rousselot returned to the House floor and said Congress could be assured that gold bullion was at Fort Knox. Members had entered the depository. They had seen it. "It is there," he said. That sentence answered the simplest rumor. It did not verify every bar. Treasury's own later chronology is explicit about the order. The Government Accountability Office audit followed the congressional visit. First spectacle, then audit. GAO selected 3 of the 13 compartments then used at Fort Knox for its examination. It found no differences between the gold stored in those compartments and the depository's records. Treasury's Inspector General later described that work as covering about 21% of the gold bars at Fort Knox. 3 of 13 rooms and 21% of the bars are not conflicting numbers. Rooms are different sizes, but they measure different things, and they should not be merged. The clean result is this. GAO opened a minority of the compartments, checked about 1/5 of the bars, and found agreement in what it examined. Once again, a partial audit produced confidence in a larger holding. This is where 4 different actions are often collapsed into one word. A visit is not an inventory. An inventory is not an assay. An assay is not necessarily performed on every bar, and an audit does not always require opening every door. The members of Congress who entered Fort Knox in 1974 could answer a visual question. Is there a large quantity of gold in this building? GAO could answer a narrower record question in the compartments it selected. Do the bars we counted agree with the depository's records? The assay process could answer a material question for selected bars. Does the metal contain the fineness the records claim? And a continuing audit could answer a custody question over time. Have compartments already inventoried remained sealed while the unfinished compartments enter the program? Each answer has value. None answers every possible question. The argument over Fort Knox persists because people ask for one of these procedures and officials answer with another. We audit the gold every year is true in the language of financial statements and controls. You did not reopen and recount every bar this year can be true at the same time. The dispute is not solved by choosing which sentence sounds more suspicious. It is solved by naming the procedure. But this time, Treasury decided not to stop with the sample. On June 3, 1975, the Secretary of the Treasury issued Department Order 234-1. The title was plain: Audit of Gold Stock. The order did not command one enormous recount. It created a continuing audit. That choice made the next 33 years possible. It also created the peculiar meaning of 100%. Before following the timeline, we need to enter one compartment. Not because every compartment was tested in precisely the same way in every year. The documented procedures evolved, but the Inspector General's description shows what a serious physical inventory could include when a door was opened. First, auditors visually inspected the bars. They compared the records for the compartment with the identifying information stamped into the gold. Then they selected a statistical sample. Those bars were reweighed, and selected bars were drilled. A drill removes fragments from inside the bar. The fragments go to an independent laboratory. The lab assays them and reports directly to the auditors. That distinction is important. The auditors did not drill every bar. Most bars were verified through observation, records, stamps, and weight controls. Fineness was tested on a statistical sample. In fiscal 2008, the Inspector General described a sample representing more than $75 million in inventory. The independent assay produced a projected difference of $3,819.84. 0.005%. That is the strongest case for the official system. It did not merely let visitors look at a wall of yellow metal. It used records, identifiers, scales, drills, and an outside laboratory. Follow one bar through that process. Its stamped identity is matched to the compartment record. It is counted where it rests. If it enters the statistical sample, it is lifted, weighed, and perhaps drilled for an independent assay. If it does not, its identity and place still contribute to the compartment inventory. Then the bar disappears from view again, not into an undocumented darkness, but behind a signed custody document fixed to the door. And when the compartment was finished, the auditors created the object that allowed the result to survive after they left: the official joint seal. The name makes it sound like a stamp of wax. It was more than that. The Treasury Inspector General described it as a pre-numbered document that included wax seals. It was attached to the inventoried compartment door with tamper-proof cloth tape. The document recorded the relevant inventory, the number of bars, the gross weight, the fine troy ounces, and it was signed by the people present: a representative of the storage facility, someone from Mint headquarters, and an Inspector General or independent observer. A broken wax seal or detached cloth tape would be immediately visible. Think about what the document does. Inside the room is a physical claim. These bars exist. On the door is a custody claim. This is the room that was counted. This is what it contained. These are the people who observed it, and this barrier has remained intact since they closed it. Without the seal, every future auditor would have to open the room and repeat the inventory. With the seal, a future auditor can inspect the boundary and inherit the work. The system turns a count into a chain. And the chain, not one dramatic inspection, is how the government eventually reaches every compartment. The first continuing team was called the Committee for Continuing Audit of the United States government-owned gold. It included internal audit staff from the Bureau of Government Financial Operations and the Mint, along with general auditor staff from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. From 1975 to 1986, it performed annual audits of the deep storage reserves. Compartments that it inventoried and tested were placed under official joint seal. Then the committee stopped. The Inspector General's later testimony said that by 1986, 97% of the gold held by the Mint had been audited and sealed. GAO used a different figure for roughly the same period. About 92% had been audited by GAO or the Continuing Committee. Those numbers probably reflect different denominators or cutoffs. The sources do not give us permission to blend them. What matters for the chain is that neither number was 100. The job was unfinished. From 1986 to 1992, the Mint continued annual inventory and verification work over compartments that the committee had not placed under joint seal. Then Treasury's Office of Inspector General took over annual audits of the Mint's schedule of custodial deep storage gold beginning in fiscal 1993. Different people, different organizational lines, different years, the same accumulating claim. GAO had counted some. The Continuing Committee counted more. The Mint worked on compartments that remained outside the seal system. The Inspector General carried the schedule forward. At the end of fiscal 2008, Treasury's Inspector General said the chain was complete. All 42 deep storage compartments had been audited by GAO, the Continuing Committee, or Treasury OIG, and placed under official joint seals. 42. This is where a visually attractive fact can become a false picture. The 42 compartments were not all at Fort Knox. They were spread across the Mint's deep storage facilities, Fort Knox, Denver, and West Point. Do not imagine 42 identical vault doors in Kentucky. Imagine 42 separate boxes in a national custody system, each entering the audited set in a different year. The Inspector General's statement was categorical. 100% of the US government's deep storage gold reserves in mint custody had been inventoried and audited. No noteworthy exceptions had been found. The physical security, he said, was absolute. He could say that without hesitation, he told Congress, because he had personally seen the gold. That was the government's strongest witness, speaking to a subcommittee chaired by one of its loudest skeptics, Ron Paul. And on its own terms, the claim is coherent. Every compartment entered the process. Every inventoried compartment was sealed. The inventory and the custody records agreed. But the event existed only as a 34-year line drawn backward through documents. There was never a day when the last room and the first room were open under one team. The first room had been closed for decades when the final room completed the set. That is 100% cumulative coverage. It is not one simultaneous count. Imagine a library claiming that every book has been checked. On Monday, one team verifies the first shelf and locks it behind glass. On Tuesday, another team verifies the second shelf and accepts Monday's unbroken lock. Years later, a final team reaches the final shelf. At that moment, the library can truthfully say that every book has been checked. But no team has ever stood in a room with every shelf open. And the first shelf has not been seen since Monday. The strength of the claim now depends on two things, not one: the quality of each old count and the integrity of every lock after it. That is the Fort Knox system in plain language. The gold behind an old seal does not become uncounted merely because time passes. But the longer the chain becomes, the more the present depends on records created by people who are no longer present. This is why the official joint seal is not a footnote to the inventory. It is the technology that makes the phrase 100% possible across 34 years. What happens after 2008? If the gold has not moved and the seals have not broken, reopening every room would destroy the very control that tells you the inventory remained untouched. So in the Inspector General's description of the 2009 and 2010 audits, the primary physical procedure was not recounting bars. It was inspecting the official joint seals to determine whether they had been altered or compromised. The auditors found no exceptions. This is the point critics often describe as, "they only check the seals." That phrasing can sound absurd, as if an auditor glanced at a dab of candle wax and went home. But in a custody system, the barrier is evidence. If an identified compartment was fully inventoried, the contents did not move, and the signed, tamper-evident boundary remained intact, then the old count is still the count. The critic's answer is also reasonable. The chain is only as strong as its oldest link, its access controls, its records, and the independence of the people maintaining it. A seal inspection confirms continuity. It does not produce a fresh physical observation of every bar behind the door. Both statements can be true. That is why audited every year and not all recounted are not contradictions. They describe different jobs. In 2010, the Mint replaced the old official joint seals. The Inspector General said the replacement was carried out for all 42 compartments in the presence of a Treasury OIG auditor. He personally participated at Fort Knox in September and saw the reserves there. The new seals were not the wax and cloth documents that make such a striking historical image. They were more durable double security barriers that could be removed only with 2 cuts from a strong cable cutter. So the line, "America's gold is guarded today by a wax seal," would be wrong. The wax seal belongs to the historical inventory system. It is the visual record of how separate counts were made inheritable. The modern barrier replaced it. The logic remained: inventory once, seal, inspect the boundary, audit the schedule. Unless the boundary changes, do not repeat the entire physical count. There was one moment when the visible technology of that chain changed. In fiscal year 2010, the Mint replaced all of the previously placed official joint seals. All 42 deep storage compartments were included, and a Treasury Inspector General auditor was present during the replacement process. At Fort Knox that September, the Inspector General himself, Eric Thorson, took part. He later told Congress that he personally saw the deep storage gold located there. This is a useful fact. It is also a fact that needs the right label. Thorson was not claiming that he personally counted every bar across all 3 storage facilities. He was describing a seal replacement operation, his own presence at Fort Knox, and his confidence in the custody system. The old seals were documents with wax and cloth tape. The new barriers were more durable. Treasury described them as double security barrier seals that could be removed only by making 2 cuts with a strong cable cutter. So if we ask whether America's gold is still guarded by a wax seal today, the answer is no. The wax belongs to the historical system that built the inventory chain. The double barrier belongs to the system that maintains it. But notice what survived the replacement. Not the material, the logic. A barrier does not tell an auditor what is inside a room. It tells the auditor whether the room has been entered since a known state was established. That is why replacing the barrier did not erase the old inventories. The old count remained in the records. The supervised replacement connected that inherited record to a new physical boundary. Imagine taking a signed envelope whose paper has become brittle. You do not prove every page inside by moving the contents into a stronger envelope. You preserve a custody transition. Who handled it, when the old barrier ended, when the new barrier began, and whether the transfer showed evidence of interference. That is weaker than rereading every page. It is stronger than simply trusting an untouched door. And it exposes the exact burden carried by a chain of custody system. Every link must mean something. The original inventory must be credible. The seal must make entry evident. The inspection must be competent. The replacement must be observed. The records must connect the old barrier to the new one. If those conditions hold, continuity can preserve evidence for decades. If one fails, the chain cannot repair itself by repetition of the word audited. The 2010 operation therefore gives both sides something important. For Treasury, it is evidence that the custody barrier was not simply forgotten after 2008. Every deep storage compartment received a stronger seal under observation, and the Inspector General could testify from personal presence at Fort Knox. For a skeptic, it is a reminder of what the modern claim still depends on. Not a new simultaneous inventory, but a supervised handoff from old records and old barriers to new ones. The wax came off. The count did not begin again. The chain continued. The argument returned to national politics in February 2025. President Donald Trump said Elon Musk would look at Fort Knox to make sure the gold was there. The administration, he said, would open the doors and inspect. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent responded that Treasury conducted an audit every year and that the gold was accounted for. Those two statements passed each other in public. One imagined a new physical spectacle. The other described the existing control system. By the end of 2025, Treasurer Brandon Beach said that the gold was there. In 2026, Bessent said members of his staff, including the Treasurer, had visited and that the gold was present and accounted for. A senior visit is evidence of a visit. An assurance is evidence that an official gave an assurance. Neither is a published independent full inventory. As of this episode's research lock on July 27, 2026, no public order tied to that visit had been found specifying a new method. No list of opened compartments, no bar-by-bar inventory, no new assay report, no independent report of a simultaneous count. That does not mean nothing was inspected. It means the public evidence does not justify calling the visit a new full audit. The latest published Treasury OIG report, released in December 2025, audited the Mint's schedules of custodial deep storage gold and silver reserves as of September 30th, 2025 and 2024. It concluded that the schedules were fairly presented in all material respects. The deep storage gold figure remained 245.3 million fine troy ounces across the Mint's locations. Again, not Fort Knox alone. The report tested evidence on a sample basis. It relied on the Mint's books and records in producing the schedules. It did not describe opening every compartment and counting every bar at once. This is a financial audit of a custody schedule supported by an existing control system. It is not the event people picture when someone says, "Count the gold." And that gap explains two bills introduced in Congress in 2025. The House and Senate versions of the Gold Reserve Transparency Act would require a qualified independent third party to perform a full assay, inventory and audit, and repeat it every 5 years. The bill's sponsors use phrases like the first true or credible audit. Those are political claims, not neutral findings. But the proposed remedy reveals what the current system does not provide. One independent party, one defined operation, one public methodology, and a fresh physical account of the whole reserve. As of July 27, 2026, neither bill had become law. The dispute is therefore not proof of an empty vault or proof that a new count is pointless. It is a choice between two audit designs. The existing system values continuity. Count compartments in sequence, seal them, inspect the barriers, and avoid reopening them without evidence of a break. The proposed system values simultaneity. Open the whole reserve under one disclosed operation and rebuild confidence from a common date. A new simultaneous inventory would cost time, break existing barriers, and require the bars to be handled. It would also produce one thing the current chain cannot: a complete physical account anchored to one date. Neither choice changes what happened between 1974 and 2008. So, has America's gold been counted? Yes, not in the mythical 1953 full count, and not in one operation. It was counted through a relay that began in 1974, continued through multiple institutions, and by 2008 had admitted every one of the 42 deep storage compartments across Fort Knox, Denver, and West Point into the audited and sealed set. That is the factual foundation of Treasury's 100% claim. Has all the gold been counted at once? No, not in 1953, not in 1974, not in the 34-year relay, and not in any new published operation tied to the recent political visit. That does not prove the gold is missing. The documented audits found no significant discrepancy. The custody system has a rational design. When compartments were opened, auditors did real work: identifiers, weights, drills, independent assays. The seals created a traceable boundary. Modern financial audits continue to test the schedules and controls. It also does not make a new count redundant by definition. A simultaneous independent inventory would answer a different question. It would not ask whether every compartment had once been audited. It would ask what one team can verify now, under one method, without inheriting 34 years of unopened doors. The viral story gives us an empty vault nobody has checked since 1953. That story is false. The official story gives us 100%. That story is true only if we understand its unit of measurement. Not bars counted on one day. Compartments admitted into a chain. And the most important object in that chain may be the one nobody came to see. Not the gold bar on the scale, the pre-numbered document on the door. Bar count, gross weight, fine troy ounces, 3 signatures, wax and cloth tape, a physical inventory converted into a promise to the next auditor. You do not need to open this room again unless the boundary has changed. For 34 years, America counted its gold one sealed compartment at a time. Then it began counting on the seals.